We're continuing today in Luke chapter 19, where we left off last week with the parable of the 10 minas. Probably, if I said who's familiar with the parable of the talents, I imagine we'd get close to 100% people familiar with the parable of the talents. But if I say the parable of the minas, maybe not 100%. Maybe, I don't know. It's not as familiar to me, at least. I don't know if I can speak for you. I'm more familiar with the parable of the talents. But the parable of the 10 minas is very similar to the parable of the talents. And it's another example of how, as we've studied through Luke, how we find familiar teachings of Jesus and that are slightly different. And I say familiar because I don't know, again, I think this seems to be common experience, at least it is in my case. For whatever reason, and I really think it might just be the order in which they put them together in our Bibles, that I'm more familiar with Matthew's accounts of things. So the parable of the talents is in Matthew 25. And I've preached out of that since back when I was in college. I've just used that text many times. And for whatever reason, I'm just more, I guess I've read more often in Matthew's account than I have Luke's, and shame on me for that. But as we've studied through Luke, I find a lot of things that are familiar, of course, that are similar to the passages in Matthew, but sometimes there's a slight difference. As an example, you might recall a few months ago, I guess now, we had a similar passage to the Sermon on the Mount, but it's called the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. And there's a passage similar to the Beatitudes, but it's a little bit different. And a lot of times you find, if you look carefully, that it seems to be a different context, a different audience, a different time, and slightly different teaching. And it makes sense if you think about it. As Jesus traveled from place to place and encountered various people, that he would use the same message or the same illustrations, the same, basic points to different audiences, maybe slightly different. And that's the same thing that we have here. Comparing the setting of these two, this parable is just as Jesus is about to enter Jerusalem. He's, in fact, right after, if you just kind of scan down, you'll see that what we call the triumphal entry. That kicks off basically the last week leading up to his crucifixion, the following week. So if I've got my timeline right, this is kind of on the weekend before the following week is when he would be betrayed and the trial and all those events. Notice in verse 11, as they heard these things, he proceeded to tell a parable because he was near to Jerusalem and because they supposed the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. So he was approaching Jerusalem. If you were to go over to see what's happening in Matthew 25 for the parable of talents, you would find that we're told that it was as they were leaving the temple, the disciples pointed out the buildings of the temple, and it started a discussion. And he says at the end of that it's 2 days to the Passover. So that would have been midweek of the next week. So these two teachings are just a matter of days apart. The disciples were probably there for both of them. But I think this conversation that we're looking at today as they're approaching Jerusalem probably had a lot larger audience. The one in Matthew 25, they withdrew, and he was talking to them on the Mount of Olives for that parable. And so this parable, which is similar to the talents, has one extra group of people that it addresses, and we'll see that. And I think the reason for that is probably because there was a larger audience for this parable. So I just wanted to say all that because you'll see as we read through it, this is really similar to the talents, but there are some interesting differences between them, and I'll draw those to your attention to those as we go. Let's first just read through it and then back up and kind of break it down. Beginning in verse 11. As they heard these things, he proceeded to tell a parable because he was near to Jerusalem and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. He said, therefore, a nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return. Calling 10 of his servants, he gave them 10 minas and said to them, engage in business until I come. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we do not want this man to reign over us. When he returned, having received the kingdom, he ordered these servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. The first came before him, saying, Lord, your mina has made 10 minas more. And he said to him, well done, good servant. Because you've been faithful in a very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities. The second came, saying, Lord, your mina has made 5 minas. And he said to him, you are to be over 5 cities. Then another came, saying, Lord, here is your mina, which I kept laid away in a handkerchief, for I was afraid of you, because you are a severe man. You take what you did not deposit and reap what you did not sow. And he said to him, I will condemn you with your own words, you wicked servant. You knew that I was a severe man, taking what I did not deposit and reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put my money in the bank? And at my coming I should have collected it with interest. And he said to those who stood by, take the mina from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas. They said to him, Lord, he has 10 minas. I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given, but to the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. As for these enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Okay, clearly, if you've got the parable of talents in mind, a lot of similarities, right? Including the guy that took it and hid it and came back and was found wanted. But there are some differences, and so let's just back up now and look at it in a little more detail. First of all, there's 2 things that he mentions as the context for this. There's 2 things that spurned it on. In verse 12, well, not in verse 12, in verse 11, the 2 things are because he was near Jerusalem and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. The 2 elements of the context are he's approaching Jerusalem, and I think meaning in this case for that week that would lead up to his death. He had already predicted it was happening, so he knew that's where he was going, and they're getting very close. So that's one thing. The second aspect of it is that they were assuming that some things were going to happen immediately. But you'll recall that in the parable, it is that a man went away to a far country to receive a kingdom, and he was gone for a while. And this is a common aspect of several of the parables where Jesus leaves some servants in charge. You might recall there's one where there's a vineyard. There's several of those where he gives them charge over something. The master goes away for a while, and then he comes back. There was another one where he was delayed in coming back, and they were still looking for him and all that. But this aspect of the delay in his return is a common theme because he's going to go away, and they're going to have to wait for his return. And in fact, where we are right now in the timeline is he's gone away to receive the kingdom, and we're waiting for him to return. And so that's the setting of the parable as a whole, is this: when he returns, they're going to have to give account. So verse 12, a nobleman goes into a far country to receive a kingdom. Clearly, Jesus is the nobleman who's going to go. He has left, he has received a kingdom, and now we are waiting on him to come back. When he does, in verse 13, before he leaves, he calls 10 of his servants, and he gave them 10 minas and said, engage in business until I come. Very often the parables have this idea of at some point someone is called to give account for their stewardship, what they've done in the master's absence, and that's the setup to this as well. We're going to think about that some more, but first let's introduce this new group, new to the talents, that is. Verse 14, but his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we do not want this man to reign over us. Okay, that part's different from the parable of the talents. That there's a new group added here. You have the master and his servants, and then there's some other people. It's pretty clear these are not his servants who are saying this, but some citizens. These are people that he would have had a rightful claim to rule over, but they rejected his rule over them. And so if you think about Jesus, he's got his disciples, his followers. And then there's the other people of Israel, the leaders, the regular Jews, the ones who did not believe in him, who, even though he was the Son of God and the king after this, the lineage of David, they rejected him and killed him. And so I think that's why this group of people is added into the parable as well. Probably some of them were walking along with them, listening. There are people that were around that did not believe on Jesus. And they're going to be addressed when we get, of course, to the very end of the parable. The rest of the parable focuses on the servants that he had entrusted his minas to. Verse 15 says, when he returned, having received the kingdom, he ordered these servants to whom he had given money to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. The first came and said, Lord, your mina has made 10 minas more. So now let's stop and think about these minas. What is the mina? Well, it is a Greek, just like a talent and a mina are both units of money. They're just not familiar units of money to us, but they were units of money. The mina was worth 100 denarii. Denarii is a day's wage. So 100 denarii would be 100 days' wages, so 3 to 4 months' pay. A talent, for what it's worth, is worth a lot more, 6,000 denarii. So 60 minas to get to a talent. So a talent's a big unit of money. Mina is a smaller unit of money, but still a significant amount. Not pocket change. It was 100 days' wages. So you figure that's a lot. That's a lot of money. So it was something of value. The exact quantity of that value is not what's significant. It was just that he entrusted them with something valuable that they were going to have to use wisely while he was gone. Another difference, and I think this is a significant difference between this one and the talents, is that he says there were 10 servants and he gave them 10 minas. And each one, when he reports, says, here's your mina. So it seems clear that he gave each one a mina. So you have 10 servants, everybody gets a coin. Whereas you recall in the parable of the talents, it said he distributed his money to them, each according to their ability. So there was a man who got 5 talents, another man that got 2, and a man that got 1. So in that parable, in the talents, the thing that he was giving them stewardship over was distributed based on their ability. But in this parable, everyone is given the same thing to begin with. So all 10 servants each are given a mina to see what they will do with it. What do the minas actually represent? Sometimes when Jesus finishes a parable, the disciples will say, hey, tell us about that parable, and he'll break it down. Like the parable of the sower is a good example. He says, seed is the word, and he explains each thing. But this is one where he doesn't do that. So we're left to try to understand it and draw our own conclusions. What do you suppose the minas represent? Well, it's something of value, some resource, something that the disciples were given ownership of until he returned and then called to give account for what they had done with it. What could that be? I think we can apply it in lots of ways, and maybe that's the reason why it's left open-ended. There's a lot of things that we could imagine that would fit into this, the overall message of this parable. I want to suggest 3 possible meanings that for you to consider. First of all would be the gospel itself. As he was leaving, if you'll recall, before he left, entrusted them with a message to take to the world. If you were to hold your place there, we'll come back there, but look over at the very end of Luke in chapter 24. As he's about to depart to go to the far country, he leaves them with something of value. In Luke 24, beginning in verse 45, he opened their minds to understand the scriptures and said to them, thus it is written that the Christ should suffer and on the 3rd day rise from the dead, and that repentance for the forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things, and behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you, but stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high. And then the way the book ends, he ascended into heaven. So they were given, before he left, a valuable treasure, the word of the gospel, the word of salvation. Paul understood that as a treasure. He describes it this way in 2 Corinthians 4. For God, who said, let the light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. So the knowledge of God and the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ is something that was of like a treasure, like a gold coin that has been given to first the apostles and then to others. But that was like a treasure that was carried around in a clay pot. And they were the clay pot, the humans but inside the clay pot is something of value, and that is this knowledge, the gospel. And Paul understood that having been given this thing of value, that he would one day have to answer for what he did with it as a steward. He says in 1 Corinthians 4, this is how one should regard us, and there the us is the apostles, if you were to look at the context. As servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. So he understood, I've been given something of value, and I'm going to have to answer for what I have done with it. And he goes on to say, therefore do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness, and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God. So to me, I can see a parallel to the parable of the minas and the gospel, and the way that Paul describes it here, that they were handed something of value. The Lord ascended and went away, but when he comes back, he's going to want to know, what did you do with what I gave you? How did you make use of it? And so they took what they were given and passed it on to others, and by doing that, it multiplied. And Paul would tell to Timothy, the things that you receive from me, entrust to faithful men who will teach others. And so down through the ages, this thing grows and grows and grows to where generation after generation passes this treasure down. And then we can share that treasure with others. So I think that's one application we could make of the minas. Another one is thinking of the parable of the talents. Whenever we study the parable of the talents, we think about abilities. Because in that parable, it says he distributed according to each ability. So you have people that had differing abilities. And that's still the case, that people have abilities. Paul refers to those as gifts. And notice that he talks about what we should do with those gifts that we've been given. In Romans 12, having gifts that differ according to the grace given us, let us use them. If prophecy in proportion to our faith, if service in our serving, the one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. So he compares these to gifts that were given to us by grace. So if someone has a gift for serving, or a gift for teaching, or a gift for contributing, maybe they've been blessed with things and they can contribute, whatever those things are that we have, our abilities, if you think of that as some gift that was handed to you, then that's sort of like this mina, where the Lord, before he leaves, he doles out these coins. And then at the end of it all, he wants to know, what did you do with that? And Paul says, having these gifts, various gifts that we all have, depending on what our capability are, let's put them to use. And that was the whole idea. The Lord comes back and said, why didn't you do anything? I gave you something of value and you didn't do anything with it. That was the guy that got in trouble. He didn't do anything. He didn't use his coin. But the ones who were pleasing had taken the coin and put it to some use. So in this case, Paul is saying, hey, use the gifts that you've been given. Put them to use. You have this time, because there's going to come a day when we're going to give account for what we have done with what we were entrusted. And the third thing is, I think we can apply this to material goods as well. You'll recall a few weeks ago in chapter 12 of Luke, the man who had the big crop, and then he had to figure out what he's going to do with it. He tore down his barns and built bigger barns. Well, he was blessed with extra stuff, in this case, an abundance of a crop. But instead of sharing it, instead of using it, instead of applying it in some way that would serve God, he hoarded it, which I think would be the same as the guy that wraps up his coin in a cloth, and he just kept it and he didn't put it to use. So if God has blessed us with material things, do we take those things and use them for his glory? Let's turn to 2 Corinthians 9. This passage was too long to fit on the screen. One thing that's interesting about these minas is that they have the ability to grow. The guy says, hey, I took your 1, I made 10. The other guy says, I took their mina, I made 5. So it was God had blessed them, or the Lord gave them this coin, but somehow by doing stuff with it, it turned into more coins. And there's an interesting thing that's said here about our material blessings as well in 2 Corinthians 9. When we use those in the Lord's service, he can make it multiply so that you can start with something and turn it into something bigger. Notice how this is described in verses 6 through 10. The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly. Whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he's decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. As it is written, he has distributed freely, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. So in this passage, it's as if the master goes to his servants and gives each one some seed. And then if you take that seed and you sow it bountifully, you will reap a bigger crop, which produces more seed for doing even more, right? So he will multiply your harvest if you sow bountifully. But what would happen if the master gave you like some seed and you just tucked it away and put it in a cellar? Well, you wouldn't have any harvest at all. And that's what happens here. But in this case, the seed is money. He's saying give generously, like contribute, because God, who provides us with what we have, will multiply that and will cause it to grow. Not saying here's a get rich kind of plan, but that if you are a conduit of blessings, then that can grow so that you can do even more blessing. You can do even more. You can take what God's given you and use it for his glory, and then he'll bless you with even more to use for his glory and to increase your harvest of righteousness by sowing it bountifully. So anyway, those are three possible ways. I think you could think of others. I thought about time, our lives. I think there's lots of ways you could say, what could this mina represent? It's really anything of value that you have control over, that you could use for the Lord's service, that you could apply. So those are three ways to think about it: the gospel, our abilities, and our resources. Now, let's go to the judgment scene back in our parable. The first guy comes in verse 16 saying, Lord, your mina has made 10 minas more. He put it to use. Also recognize that he says your mina, not my mina. He knew all along that what he had been given belonged to the master. He was just given stewardship over it. That's an important thing to understand. Number 17, verse 17, and he said, well done, good servant, because you've been faithful over very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities. Now, I don't understand these cities. I would welcome your thoughts about that. He compares it in value of something very little to something big. He gave them something small, even though the mina was valuable. By comparison to the value of a city, it was very small. So he says, you were faithful over something of small value. You're going to be given authority over something of great value. What is that? I don't know exactly. What does the city represent? Anyway, you think about that. If you have some ideas, share them with me. Something of great value. It's a reward for their faithful service. Then the second came, verse 18, saying, Lord, your mina has made 5 minas. He said to him, you are to be over 5 cities. And then we come to 2 negative judgments. So there were 2 men who did well. There was a man who does bad, and then you have those enemies. So let's just read 20 through 26 again. Then another came to him saying, Lord, here's your mina which I kept laid away in a handkerchief. For I was afraid of you because you are a severe man. You take what you did not deposit, reap what you did not sow. And then he says to him, I'll condemn you with your own words, you wicked servant. You knew I was a severe man, taking what I did not deposit, reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put the money in the bank? And at my coming, I might have collected it with interest. And he said to those who stood by, take the mina from him and give it to the one who has the 10 minas. They said, Lord, he has 10 minas. And he said, I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. The one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. What had this man done? Nothing at all. He had done nothing. His excuse, he blamed the master. It's your fault. The reason I didn't do anything is because you are harsh. You are not fair. He basically accused him also of being dishonest, taking what you did not deposit. I mean, he almost accused him of being a thief. But he really paints the master out in a very negative light. And Of course, this excuse is not going to work. It's probably worth noting that many people who refuse to serve God paint God out to be a tyrant as their excuse. They dismiss God and their obligation to God by saying, well, God is cruel and mean. And that makes it easier for them to excuse themselves. But that doesn't work, of course. In fact, it lumps him in with those people who are the enemies. Verse 27, as for these enemies of mine, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. So he becomes sort of like one of those enemies who looks at the master negatively, and it says they hated him, and they're going to be punished. So let's think through about this judgment, and there's some interesting things I think we can learn about this, about the judgment, because this question came up, and I've been thinking about it ever since it did. A few weeks ago on a Wednesday night in class, the question about the judgment came up. We were talking about hope. And we were talking about hope and our hope in salvation and our confidence in salvation, our confidence in the reward. And then the question comes up, well, exactly how, I'm putting in my own words, but how confident can we be given that there's a day of judgment coming, and how do we know if we've done enough, right? How do I know, and if I've done enough so that I will hear on that day, well done, good and faithful servant? And of course, the quick response is, well, you never can do enough. So you can kind of forget about that. You can be sure you won't do enough, and you haven't done enough, and you can't do enough. So it's not about doing enough. It's about having faith and being saved by grace. Well, so as soon as we say that, and then in my mind, I'm thinking, yes, but that's interesting, that's true, and there's certainly passages that teach that. But then you do have these passages where Jesus talks about a judgment day, where people are called to give account, and some were pleasing and some were not. And so what's the message here, and how does it fit? How do Jesus' teachings about the judgment fit with the other teachings that we have about salvation by faith and grace, where it's not up to us to be saved by works? How do we make these things come together? But this parable, I had an aha moment studying this. So I'm excited to share it with you. Let's think about what went wrong with the guy who was punished, the one who didn't do anything. And let's compare him to the other two. First of all, you have the one guy, he comes up, the first guy. I took your mina, and it made 10. When I put it to use, it made 10 minas. And he really almost doesn't take credit for that as something he did, but he just used what he'd been given, and it multiplied, and he got 10. He says, well done. The next guy also had the same thing. He had a mina. He says, your mina made 5 minas. I used it, and it made 5. And he says, good, Notice that he doesn't say to the guy that did 5, well, he made 10. Why did you only do 5? There's no criticism at all. He doesn't say, well, the quota was 8. Clearly miners are capable of making 10. If you did anything at all, you could have made 10. Why did you do 5? That's only half. You got 50% of what you could have done. If you had only worked a little harder, you could have made. There's none of that. There's no criticism of the 5 versus the 10. It's that each of them had put the mina to use. Compare that with the only servant who is condemned is the one who wraps it up in a handkerchief and stuffs it away. He does literally nothing. But it's worse than that. It's not just that he does nothing. I think it's equally important to understand his reasoning. Why did he not use it? And what he says is, I didn't do this because I was afraid of you. And he says, the reason I'm afraid of you is because you are harsh. You are cruel. You take what doesn't belong to you. So I didn't do anything because you are, the fault is in you. Basically, he's saying, I can't trust you, right? In other words, you could boil his problem down to a complete lack of faith in the master. Notice what we're told in Hebrews 11. These are the core elements of faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe these two things, that he is and that he rewards those who seek him. Right? What does the zero talent guy, what the man who didn't do anything with his mina, what does he say? He says, I didn't do anything because I was afraid of you, because I knew you're harsh, and you take what doesn't, where you haven't sowed, and reap where you haven't sowed, take what you didn't deposit. He's saying, I don't trust you. But it is essential, if we're going to please God, that we believe in God, but we also, a core element of faith is trusting God, that if we seek him, he will reward us. So it's that relationship is one of trust and faith, that we take what he's given us, we put it to use, and we trust in him, that that's what we're supposed to do, that we're doing. And so it really boils down to faith. And what saved, you could say, what saved the two people who did something was their faith. The grace is in the fact that they were given what they needed. They couldn't have come up with it on their own. They were given what they needed. Their faith is in simply doing something with it and trusting the master. The man who failed had no faith. And we see that because he didn't obey. I mean, that's obvious. He didn't do anything. But we also see it in his own words that he did not trust the master. He had no faith in the master. So if we have faith, then what we do is we take what he's given us, we put it to use, and then we trust that he will reward those who seek him. And so that's, I think, how maybe these ideas fit together. We can have confidence in the reward because we trust our master to be good and loving and compassionate and merciful. We don't think of him as harsh and cruel and exacting and unfair. We think of him as kind and loving. And so we serve him joyfully, and we serve him with confidence and trust in him, not trust in ourselves, but trust in him because of who he is. And the way that we view God, the way that we think of him, makes all the difference in whether we have faith and whether we serve him joyfully or we refuse to serve him, as this man did. Perhaps there's someone here this morning who needs to give your life to the Lord. He's trusted you with something of great value, which is your freedom of will, your own life. But you have an opportunity to put it to use for him or to use it selfishly for yourself. And the difference in those two will determine what you hear on the day of judgment. And if we can help you this morning, let us know as we stand and sing.